join me in welcoming Bjørn Kristensen to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. This is just going to be a brief kind of discussion around some ideas within Western moral philosophy about animals, going from past kind of historical figures into more contemporary figures. So moral status, what is moral status? So basically moral status is looking at questions about what matters, who matters, what sort of obligations we might have to someone, what are our reasons for acting in a certain way towards them, and yeah, what do we owe to them? So I think a certain way of looking at this is we could take this stuffed animal. So could say, here you go, Rob. Let's say Rob breaks into my house, takes that stuffed animal and tears it apart against my will. Would that be wrong? Most people would say that's wrong. But why would they say it's wrong? They would say it's wrong because that's connected to me somehow. I care about that. And, you know, I guess another way of saying this, thinking about this, is how would that change if that was an actual lizard versus a stuffed lizard? And what is significantly different between me and between that stuffed animal that gives me moral status, that makes that valuable in a morally important way? And is there something significantly different between an animal and me in terms of moral standing? So historically, a lot of philosophers looked at this and they said humans have a certain kind of privilege, they have moral standing, they have moral status simply because they're human. And so I think that's actually a really problematic way to go about thinking about this, and thankfully a lot of contemporary philosophers have taken that to task. So I'm going to start with going into a historical look at this. So Plato had this idea of the tripartite soul. So plants essentially have a vegetative soul, animals appetitive or sensitive, and humans have a rational soul. So essentially it's looking at humans as being somewhat privileged in the sense that plants and animals exist for the purposes of humans. Plants exist for animals, animals and plants both exist for humans. So Aristotle has some issues with this, but overall he also takes what's called a teleological approach to nature. So he looks at, so telos is an end purpose, logos is reason, so something exists for its end purpose. So in this view, plants and animals have value only as they relate to the purposes of humans. So another important figure in the history of philosophy, Descartes. So Descartes, what's important with him is this notion of mind-body dualism, or what we call Cartesian dualism. So under his account, which is contested, some people have written, even like within the last 30, 40 years, contested that he actually had this view. But regardless of whether he had this view or not, it's had a huge impact on the history of philosophy. So we look at animals under Descartes' view are seen as lacking a soul and a mind. So lacking a soul means that you lack consciousness. So you don't have the ability to understand if you're harmed, if you're hurt, if that animal is tortured. It may appear as if they're like really convincingly like exhibiting this particular response that shows that they are going through this pain, but it's actually just like they're automata, like they're robots being very convincing. So importantly, they don't think or have language, and they're not capable of being aware of that pain and pleasure. So Immanuel Kant, another really important figure in the history of Western moral philosophy. So Kant came up with what's known as deontological ethics, as duty or rights-based approaches to ethics. So Kant goes a little bit beyond this, the kind of historic Cartesian approach, but he still has somewhat of a teleological approach to animals. So only rational beings under Kant's take are members of what he calls the kingdom of ends. So it's important to understand the difference in this case between a moral agent and a moral patient. So importantly, a good way of thinking about this is looking at Rob over here with this lizard. I would respond differently to Rob destroying that than I would to a young child or a dog, perhaps, destroying that. I might say that's bad that they did that, but I wouldn't hold them morally accountable. So this is like a moral agent is somebody that we hold morally accountable for their actions. A moral patient is someone that we look at as deserving of certain moral obligations. Now, most of us think that, most people, I think, would intuitively say that moral patients, not all moral patients are moral agents. So if we look at young children, dogs, animals, in general, we'll say like, they're not moral agents, but we have some certain obligations to them. But But all moral agents are moral patients. So rational, fully grown adults, we look at them as being both people that we owe something to, but also people that we hold morally accountable for their actions. So Kant comes into some problems here because he says that essentially you can't be a moral patient unless you're a moral agent. So that spells problems for animals, but also spells problems for a lot of what we call marginal cases in humans. So people that are developmentally delayed, potentially young children, infants. So in this sense, he also is taking sort of a teleological approach. So if we look at this is a second manifestation of the categorical imperative, is to act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. So importantly, humanity means rational, fully developed adults, people that we hold as moral agents. So he goes on to say that animals are not self-conscious and are there merely as a means to an end. The end is man. Our duties towards animals are merely indirect duties towards humanity. So it doesn't really look significantly different for somebody to destroy that stuffed animal or somebody to harm an animal that I care about. The importance there is just that they're connected to me in some way. So if abusing animals is connected to harming humans, Kant has this next discussion up here. If he is not to stifle his own feelings, he must practice kindness towards animals, for he who is cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealings with men. So we can judge the heart of a man by his treatment of animals. So still carrying on this teleological view that if we harm animals and that translates over to the way that we treat humans, then we shouldn't harm animals. But it's not about any particular harm directly to that animal being important. It's only how it affects humans. So a basic tenet of all these ways of thinking is that there's something about rationality, language, or developed cognitive capabilities that translates over to having moral standing. There are obviously a lot of issues with looking at moral standing this way, and so thankfully a lot of philosophers have taken this to task. So if we're considering generally held human features as necessary contingencies for moral status, there are always going to be cases where some animal may have a more developed cognitive capability than some human. So for example, we would look at somebody that may be developmentally delayed. They may not have a cognitive capability that's as significant as, for example, a fully developed chimp. So it seems problematic then to say that cognitive capabilities, it translates over to some sort of higher moral standing. So then what should we look at? I think so an important discussion here then is that if we're saying that it's humans that have higher moral standing, it seems like the only thing that we really hold in common is that we all have a shared membership in the particular species of Homo sapien. And so then we're actually privileging moral status based on simply the species that we're part of. So anybody heard of the concept of speciesism? This is a really important discussion. So speciesism is discrimination based on membership in the species Homo sapien, but it's also privileging certain animals over other animals. So, for example, we care for cats and dogs, but we eat pigs, chickens, turkeys, etc. So that's also another manifestation of speciesism. So a number of philosophers have taken this to task. Most famously, figures like Peter Singer and Tom Regan, which I'm going to discuss in a few minutes. They've argued that for the same reasons that something like racism or sexism is wrong, speciesism is also wrong because you're privileging membership in the moral community based solely on the fact that you're in this particular biological category. So what's really interesting too is that there's been recent research this is in the journal Personal and Social Psychology. It was published in 2018, this Towards the Psychology of Speciesism, which is actually connected just what philosophers were saying. So the statement is that our research showed that the philosophers were right when they drew an analogy between speciesism and other forms of prejudice. Speciesism correlates positively with racism, sexism, and homophobia, and seems to be underpinned by the same socio-ideological beliefs. Similar to racism, sexism, etc., speciesism appears to be an expression of social dominance orientation, the ideological belief that inequality can be justified and that weaker groups should be dominated by stronger groups. Okay, so we don't need to go on with that. But if we're not basing this on species, what should we base moral standing on? Should it be rationality, intelligence, or language? Well, a lot of people think that maybe sentience is what's important. So sentience would be the capacity for conscious experience, the ability to value one's existence, and the ability to experience pleasure and pain. So there's lots of different ways about thinking about this too. Some people think it's just pleasure and pain that matters. Some people take a much more thorough view of it. So in the history of Western philosophy, one major figure is Jeremy Bentham. So he's the founder of utilitarianism, so consequentialist approaches to ethics. Don't need to read the whole thing, but the important statement here is that he's essentially being prophetic that there may come a day where we'll consider that the question will not be can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer. So Peter Singer kind of goes down. He's very much in the vein of Bentham. He's what we call a negative utilitarian. So he's also thinking that suffering is the most important feature that we need to take seriously. So he publishes Animal Liberation in 1975, which really takes off the modern field of animal ethics. And also he's very instrumental in the entire field of applied ethics being a field that's taken seriously. So from this quote, what's important here is that our concern for others ought not to depend on what they are like or what abilities they possess. The fact that beings are not members of our species does not entitle us to exploit them. And similarly, the fact that other animals are less intelligent than we are does not mean that their interests may be disregarded. So, along with Peter Singer, Tom Regan is also considered one of the founders of the modern field of animal ethics. So the Case for Animal Rights was published in 1983. So he's more in the vein of, he's a Kantian, so he's coming at this from a deontological, duty-based approach. So he has this concept he calls the subject of life. And so to be a subject of life, he says, involves more than merely being alive and more than merely being conscious. Individuals are subject to a life if they have beliefs and desires, perception, memory, and a sense of the future, including their own future, an emotional life together with feelings of pleasure and pain, preference, and welfare interests. The ability to initiate action in pursuit of their desires and goals, a psychophysical identity over time, and an individual welfare in the sense that their experiential life fares well or ill for them. So it's much more complex, and actually we'll probably exclude some animals, but we'll cover probably a significant portion of mammals, probably birds, the more we learn, fish, and reptiles as well, probably. So he also goes on to say that the idea is simple. It's that you don't exist for me and I don't exist for you. Anytime you reduce me to a piece of utility to advance your own aims or your purposes and so on, you violate my rights. I have a right to be treated with respect. I have a right not to be harmed unnecessarily. I have a right not to be killed, etc. So Regan's claim is that moral standing is extending then beyond that animal's sense of intrinsic value. So they're saying that because that animal values their life, there's something significant about respecting that, and they should have a right to do what they choose. It's a negative rights approach, a non-interference approach. So animals' lives then matter simply because they matter to them outside of any utility to anyone else. So this is drawing a distinction between the prevailing consequentialist and utilitarian approach that Singer, Bentham, many other philosophers within animal ethics still take. And what's key with an approach like this is that while suffering is an important feature to take seriously, it's secondary to this initial lack of recognition of that subject and their subjective interests, which matter to them independently of any welfare interests. So this draws a really important distinction within not just animal ethics, but also within animal advocacy, which is welfare versus rights approaches to animals. So the prevailing approach within groups like Mercy for Animals, Humane Society, not PETA as much, but to some degree PETA, is that they're focused on this very utilitarian consequentialist approach. It's what matters is the suffering. So obviously there's a lot of different ways of thinking about this, but I think I'm relatively in agreement with Regan's response. And he wrote about this in the same book in 1983, The Case for Animal Rights. Importantly, the bold text, the fundamental wrong is the system that allows us to view animals as our resources. So they're here for us to be eaten or surgically manipulated or exploited for sport or money. Once we accept this view of animals as our resources, the rest, as in any welfare considerations where animals are abused or hurt, is as predictable as it is regrettable. So these broad critiques are, what they do share in common is that sentience is an important feature. So there seems to be something that makes sense that I think Singer and Regan would be in agreement with, that something about sentience is morally significant, and there's something important about an animal having the ability to have a life that matters to them too. So this seems to be, for Regan, independent of them being sentient. It extends beyond this like initial statement of sentience. So this is also problematic. A lot of people take issue with what's called sentiocentrism, and maybe in a more derogatory way, they'll call it sentientism. So those that question this will say that there's something problematic about limiting moral standing to sentience. If we're trying to critique sentiocentrism, we could say that a preference for sentience is not altogether that much different than a preference for a species over another, because we're still taking this biological category and saying that's moral status based on that biological category. If you don't fit within that, you're outside of that moral standing. So it's also an individualistic perspective, so that means that moral standing is considered to be, the important feature here is that individual animals, individual humans have moral standing. It's difficult to think about something like species having moral stance in this kind of consideration. So I think it's important to push back against this. It's also could be considered hierarchical, it's teleological maybe. And I think that we can think about this though, and we can say that both an animal and a plant could still have moral standing in a consideration like this. So I think a concept like rights maybe is more difficult. So rights seems to make sense in regard to entities that can have a life that matters to them. But sentience could be seen as important in that it is a feature that we should take seriously in a relationship with animals, but it's just one feature. So it's just one way of understanding that particular form of life and what might go well for that form of life. And a lot of philosophers, Laurie Gruen, Val Plumwood, lots of people in the ecofeminist tradition will push back against this, and they'll say, but the question isn't really about like figuring out one that matters and others that don't. It's not an exclusionary perspective. It doesn't, just because we recognize sentience doesn't mean that we have to exclude non-sentient life from moral standing. So this is kind of a funny, this is Laura Gruen signed this book for me, her book Entangled Empathy, and this is after a discussion that she had given at the University of Oregon. And of course, her talk was on animal ethics, and somebody in the audience was brought up, what about plants? This is what comes up every time people talk about moral standing of animals. Or what about something like wetlands? And that was actually what they brought up. And her response was just, yes, animals, yes, plants, yes, wetlands. These things all have moral standing. But sentience is still an important feature to take seriously. So if we're looking at this as relational, or looking at capabilities, Martha Nussbaum's another really influential philosopher that looked at a capabilities approach, looking at what each unique form of life needs. So I don't have time to go too much into that, but what are the implications of this? So I think it's not just good to address maybe the problem of how we relate to animals, but what's the result of that problem? So in bringing this all together, I'd say that if animals do matter morally, and I do think they matter morally, and I think most people in this room probably do too, it has massive implications for how we relate to them. So if we look at worldwide, we kill 70 billion land animals. This is a really conservative estimate, actually. And that's expected to double by 2050. And this is not even including marine animals, and those number in the trillions. So it's almost impossible to even conceptualize a number that big. So this is what the math that I did. So if we were to look at 1 billion seconds, that's more than 31 years. And 1 billion minutes is 1,900 years. 1 billion days is 2.74 million years. So the situation is pretty dire. So how do we think about animals in this setting? And I think Joanne MacArthur is a photographer who's been really influential on my work. She's not a philosopher, but I guess what's the line between what actually is a philosopher? And the way that she talks about this, it just really hit me. So if we look at a picture like this, we see all these animals being, carted away into a truck. Probably, I'm not sure if they're going to be slaughtered or not. Either way, they're part of this system. She calls them ghosts in the machine. But we see one animal looking back, and that's the important thing here, is that to face that animal and to recognize that that this number is massive, but it starts as individuals. And we often forget that these are all individuals that make up these billions and billions of animals. And the way she talked about it was just, it starts, a number that massive starts as 1 + 1 + 1. Yeah. So, I'm just about done. Sorry, Jeff. So if we look at our justifications for why we do this to animals, not looking at anything external to this, but if we look at just animal products themselves, most of our justifications fall into these 3 categories. So this is Melanie Joy, as a social psychologist, has done work on this. So animal products are considered normal, they're considered natural, and they're considered necessary. And this is simply not the case. I would say that normal is not a morally important feature. Perhaps it is, but we usually don't say that what everyone else does is a good justification for us acting in a particular way. What's natural? Well, appeals to nature are not really that justifiable either, and there's nothing really natural about what we do to animals, the way we bred them and the way that we produce meats and animal products in mass. And eating animal products is necessary is simply not the case for 99% of the people in this country. There are certainly political issues at play here too. It's not just a reducible thing to individual choice, but most of us don't have to be doing this. So I think that veganism is the right response. I think that it aligns with the values that most of us already hold. And this is the original definition of veganism. It's a way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practical, taking into account that there are people that may not be in the position to go all that way, but if they're able to go as far as possible, they fit within that definition. All forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. So I just want to finish up with this quote, which really, I think, sums up what I feel is really important about the field of animal ethics. This is Christine Korsgaard. She says, "The reason that there is such a thing as value in the world is that there are in the world beings that matter to themselves, who experience and pursue their own good. Were there no such beings, there would be no such thing as value. Were there no such beings, nothing would matter. But we are not the only such beings. We are the beings who create the order of moral values, the beings who choose to ratify and endorse the natural concern that all animals have for themselves. But what we ratify and endorse is a condition shared by the other animals. So we are not the only beings who matter. We are the only beings who, on behalf of all animals, can shake our fists at the uncaring universe and declare that in spite of everything, we matter." So humans have this unique possibility to see what the world could be and to actually work towards that goal. But ultimately, I feel like most of us, myself included, often fall really far short of that, and that's really unfortunate, but I guess we're gonna have to end this now. So thank you. I'm looking forward to having discussion after this with individually or as a group, so thanks a lot.